March 24, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany. Private William Dean of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment looked out the door of his C-46 Commando transport aircraft at the Rhine River below and understood, even through the flak that was bursting around the formation with an intensity he had not previously experienced from the air, that what was happening around him was unlike anything that had occurred in the war to that point. As far as he could see in every direction, the sky was full of aircraft. Not dozens. Thousands. C-46 and C-47s carrying paratroopers. Gliders filled with infantry and artillery and jeeps and supplies, towed by additional transport aircraft in a chain that stretched from England to Germany. Fighter escort aircraft weaving around the formation. And below, the broad silver ribbon of the Rhine River that was the last natural barrier between the Allied armies and the heart of Germany. Operation Varsity was the largest single-day airborne operation in the history of warfare, larger even than the D-Day drops that had launched the Normandy invasion. Approximately 16,000 paratroopers and glider infantry from the American 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division were being dropped and landed in a single day on a drop zone east of the Rhine near the German town of Wesel, in support of Operation Plunder, the Allied ground crossing of the Rhine. The evolution from the Sicily disaster of 1943, when American paratroopers had been scattered across 60 miles of enemy territory by wind and navigational errors, to the concentrated and coordinated assault of March 24, 1945 represented the most significant institutional learning in the history of American airborne operations, a transformation driven by the specific lessons of Sicily and Normandy and Market Garden that had produced a force and a doctrine that could execute what Varsity required. The lessons had been purchased at great cost. Sicily had demonstrated that scatter was the fundamental problem of airborne operations and that scatter came from navigational errors, from adverse weather, and from the absence of adequate pathfinder forces to mark the drop zones for the main formation. Normandy had demonstrated that the scatter of D-Day, while less catastrophic than Sicily, still produced significant deviations from the planned drop patterns. Market Garden had demonstrated that even a well-planned airborne operation could be defeated by intelligence failures about the strength of enemy forces at the objective. Varsity incorporated the specific lessons of these failures into its planning and execution in ways that made it a different kind of operation from its predecessors. Pathfinder teams were inserted in advance to mark the drop zones with colored smoke and radar beacons that the transport aircraft could navigate to with a precision that the Sicily formation had not had. The formation itself was concentrated rather than dispersed, all aircraft dropping on the same drop zones rather than attempting to cover multiple objectives from widely separated directions. The C-46 Commando aircraft that supplemented the C-47s for the American drops had 2 jump doors rather than 1, allowing the aircraft to empty its paratroopers twice as fast and reducing the dispersion that the time difference between the first and last man in a stick jumping produced. The drop zone east of the Rhine was also, unlike the Sicily and Normandy zones, beyond the range of most German anti-aircraft artillery. The German defences on the east bank of the Rhine had been degraded by the Allied air campaign that had preceded the crossing, and the concentration of the drop allowed fighter escort to suppress the anti-aircraft positions that remained operational. Private Dean jumped at approximately 10 a.m. on March 24 and landed within a few hundred meters of his intended drop zone, a degree of accuracy that would have been extraordinary in Sicily and that Varsity's planning had made routine. The accuracy mattered because the objectives that the 17th Airborne Division had been assigned required the paratroopers to be in specific places at specific times. The drop zone east of the Rhine was overlooked by high ground that German forces would use to direct artillery fire against the Rhine crossing if it was not seized quickly. The bridges and roads that would allow the German forces to reinforce and counterattack against the bridgehead needed to be cut before German reserves could move through them. These objectives required the paratroopers to be where they were supposed to be when they were supposed to be there, which in the airborne operations of 1943 had been an aspiration and in Varsity was an achievement. The 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Dean's regiment, was assigned the critical objective of Fluren, a town on the elevated ground east of the drop zone from which German artillery had been firing on the Rhine crossing sites. Taking Fluren required moving quickly from the drop zone, organizing in the first minutes after the jump, and attacking before the German garrison had fully oriented to the airborne assault they were experiencing. The regiment reached Fluren within hours of the drop and cleared the German positions in fighting that was intense but that did not have the character of the desperate improvisational engagements that Sicily and Market Garden had produced, where scattered paratroopers had fought from whatever position they found themselves in toward whatever objective was achievable. At Varsity, the regiment fought in coordination because the regiment was where it was supposed to be, which was the specific achievement that 2 years of learning from Sicily had produced. The 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, assigned to the northern portion of the drop zone near Wesel, had the hardest fighting of the American drops, encountering German defenders who had not been adequately suppressed by the preliminary air bombardment and who were fighting with the determination of soldiers who understood that the Rhine crossing represented a strategic crisis that required them to resist regardless of the cost. Private First Class Stuart Stryker of the 507th PIR performed the action that earned him the Medal of Honor on March 24 in fighting that captured the specific character of what the 507th encountered east of the Rhine. His company was advancing through German defensive positions near Wesel when it was halted by machine gun and automatic weapons fire that the company could not suppress with the fire available to it. Stryker moved forward alone toward the position, exposing himself to fire from multiple directions, engaging the German defenders with his rifle and grenades. He destroyed the position and continued forward toward additional German positions, continuing to engage until he was killed. His action was representative of what March 24, 1945 asked of individual paratroopers in those moments when the planned operation encountered the unplanned resistance that the plan had to account for but could not specifically anticipate. The training and the culture and the specific example of what a paratrooper was supposed to do in exactly this situation produced the result that Stryker produced, not because he was unique in the specific quality his action displayed, but because that quality was what the 507th PIR and the 17th Airborne Division and the American Airborne Corps in 1945 had been built to produce. The glider elements of Varsity, carrying the heavier weapons and equipment that the paratroopers needed for the sustained fighting that would follow the initial drops, landed with an accuracy and a concentration that the Market Garden glider landings had not achieved, because the specific improvements in landing zone marking and glider pilot navigation that the lessons of Market Garden had produced were incorporated in Varsity's planning. The men who came in by glider experienced the specific chaos of the glider landing, which was never as controlled as the planning suggested it could be, with aircraft landing at different speeds and on terrain that looked different from the air than it did at the moment of contact with the ground. Gliders crashed. Men were injured in landings that were survivable but violent. Equipment was scattered. But the equipment and the men were east of the Rhine, which was the operative achievement, and within hours the anti-tank guns and the artillery pieces and the jeeps that the gliders had carried were in action supporting the paratroopers who had preceded them. The combination of airborne assault and ground crossing at Varsity was the specific coordination that the Market Garden planning had not achieved because the timing relationship between the airborne drops and the ground forces' advance had been wrong in ways that left the British 1st Airborne at Arnhem without relief for too long. At Varsity, the ground crossing of the Rhine, Operation Plunder, preceded the airborne drop by approximately 12 hours, meaning that when the paratroopers landed east of the Rhine on March 24, Allied forces were already across the river and advancing toward the drop zones. The relief that Market Garden's paratroopers had waited for in vain reached Varsity's paratroopers within hours of the drops. The connection between the two operations, the deliberate reversal of the timing relationship that Market Garden had used, was one of the specific lessons that the Market Garden failure had taught. General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the XVIII Airborne Corps that included both the 17th American and 6th British Airborne Divisions, had been one of the officers who drew those lessons from Market Garden and who had insisted that the Varsity timing reflect the correct relationship between the airborne and the ground operation. By nightfall on March 24th, the airborne forces had secured their objectives east of the Rhine, the ground forces had linked up with the paratroopers, and the last natural barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland had been crossed. Germany collapsed in the 7 weeks that followed. The crossing at the Rhine was not the single decisive blow, but it was the final major obstacle, and the campaign that followed the Rhine crossing proceeded with a speed that even the optimistic projections of Allied planning had not fully anticipated. The 17th Airborne Division, which had made its combat debut at the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and had followed the Bulge with Varsity 3 months later, accepted Germany's surrender in its area as part of the forces that occupied the country after the armistice. Operation Varsity is not well remembered by the American public, overshadowed by the drama of D-Day and Market Garden and by the concurrent battles in the Pacific that were receiving the war correspondents' attention in March 1945. It is remembered by the paratroopers who jumped on March 24th with the specific pride that soldiers have for an operation that worked the way it was planned to work, because the operations that work as planned are rarer than the operations that do not, and they are correspondingly more satisfying. What Varsity demonstrated was what 2 years of learning from the failures of Sicily and Normandy and Market Garden had produced: an American airborne force that could execute the most complex airborne operation ever attempted with a concentration and a precision that the earlier operations had not achieved and that the planning improvements they had forced had made possible. Sicily had taught concentration. Normandy had refined it. Market Garden had taught timing. Varsity applied all 3 lessons in a single day and put 16,000 Allied soldiers east of the last natural barrier in Germany. 6 weeks later, Germany surrendered. The paratroopers who had jumped at Varsity were part of Y.